defense in a landscape like this would have been beyond the abilities of any invader. But the Soviet 15th Combined Arms Army was able to make good progress as soon as their attack began on the 9th of August. In the early hours of fighting, the vital river island of Tartar was seized by an amphibious operation involving the warships of the Amur flotilla. This river fleet proved to be a telling deployment, as 15th Army headed south towards Japanese positions at Hisingan-chen and Fuchen. 2 brigades of minesweepers and cutters were able to provide vital troop mobility in the Manchurian wetlands, as well as giving artillery support for those troops taking the few reasonable land routes available. Here, as elsewhere on the 9th of August 1945, the Katyusha rocket launcher made a devastating impact on the defending forces. The strongest of land fortifications could not last long against the 132mm shells fired from the ships of the Amur flotilla. Amazingly, the Amur flotilla enabled 15th Army to advance some 700 kilometers in a period of just 12 days. There were times when progress was hampered. Even the finest of Soviet tanks could still find itself stuck fast in the mud. But by the 21st of August, an advance party of men had arrived in Harbin to be met by units of 1st Red Banner Army. 2 enormous forces of men had now connected with each other, and the battle for eastern Manchuria was all but over. It was the same story across a vast area of the Far East. 2nd Far Eastern Front was also detailed to act against the Japanese-occupied territories of southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. Here, there was perhaps more than just military considerations behind the attack. Southern Sakhalin was part of the spoils gained by Japan after her triumph in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War. This had been a national humiliation for Tsarist Russia, and it was 40 years before her Soviet successor was able to avenge the defeat. Once again, it was an amphibious operation that played a huge part as 2nd Far Eastern Front set about their objectives. A 33-ship flotilla from the base at Sovetskaya Gavan was dispatched to support a ground attack from troops sweeping down from Soviet northern Sakhalin. Despite the fiercest of Japanese resistance, the whole of the island of Sakhalin was soon in Soviet hands. For the capture of the Kurils, an even bigger flotilla was required. 49 ships were used to land an entire division of troops for an assault against a well-established occupying force. Again, the fighting was ferocious, but the outcome was the same. When the Japanese eventually surrendered, the Soviet Union had gained control of the entire Kuril Islands chain. The Russian state remains in possession of the islands today, despite a continuing territorial claim by the Japanese state. This legacy of the Manchuria campaign continues to be a source of tension in the northwest Pacific region. The conquest of the Kurils remains the most symbolic achievement of the men of 2nd Far Eastern Front in August 1945. With this in mind, it is remarkable to remember that the whole front was deployed in an essentially supporting role. Despite the involvement of 337,000 men, this was the smallest of the 3 enormous army groups deployed for the Manchurian offensive. All this time, to the west of the country, the 650,000 men of the Trans-Baikal Front had been engaged in an advance every bit as dramatic as anything in the east. Across 2,300 kilometers of front line, speed was once again a key element in the strategy for Trans-Baikal Front, and a heavy emphasis on motorized transport characterized resource allocation prior to hostilities. As soon as the Trans-Baikal began its attack on the 9th of August, the value of these transports was quickly demonstrated in the hostile territories of Mongolia and then Manchuria itself. The Japanese suspected that an invading army would attack along a possible 2 lines of advance, and they positioned their defences accordingly. At strongholds like the city of Hailar, the Japanese fortifications were well established, But the Soviet commanders remained confident. With the huge resources available to him, including 10,000 guns and mortars and some 2,400 tanks, Marshal Milovsky decided to attack using 10 lines of advance. One of the areas from which an attack could be readily predicted was the valley gap in the Khingan Mountains in the northwest. Japanese fortifications were especially heavy in the regions of Haila and Pokot, and the Kwantung Army could not have been especially surprised to engage troops of Soviet 36th Combined Arms Army on the 9th of August 1945. In the days that followed, the fighting in the northwest was amongst the fiercest witnessed in the entire Manchurian campaign. For the attack on the stronghold of Haila, a key role fell to the men of the 205th Tank Brigade. Having crossed the river Argun, this armoured detachment swept south towards the stronghold of Haila. In just 12 hours, they covered 100 kilometres and secured an initial position in the city. But the Japanese fought tenaciously against this forward detachment. It was only after 24 hours of bitter engagement that the 205th Tank Brigade were joined by their colleagues of the 9th Rifle Regiment as the fighting continued. It was 8 days before the region of Pokot was finally subdued, and the defences at Haila held out for a further 24 hours. The men of the Japanese 8th Independent Brigade and the 119th Infantry Division covered themselves in glory. But long before the end, they knew that the Soviet investment they faced was no more than a diversionary episode in the unfolding drama. The Soviets had known only too well of the Japanese strength in the region, and Soviet planners had been careful not to allocate the best troops for this sector of the Manchurian attack. War is necessarily an enterprise that requires cold, calculating thinking. In simple terms, the Soviet commanders were prepared to suffer large losses amongst the men of the 36th Army in the pursuit of their diversionary objectives. The real Soviet thrust was far away in the south, and from the very beginning, its progress was spectacular. Furthest south of all, the Soviet Mongolian Combined Cavalry and Mechanized Group were tasked with a march across the Mongolian desert towards the cities of Dolonor and Kalgan. By the 11th, they had advanced 200 kilometers. Similar progress was reported on the following 2 days, and by the 14th of August, the objective of Dolonor had been achieved. The sheer speed of the advance meant occasional problems with maintaining supply lines in the dusty terrain. But with the assistance of the so-called ship of the desert, the Camel, the remarkable march of the Soviet Mongolian force continued. After the capture of Dolonor, the Cavalry Mechanized Group now set off further south with the ambitious aim of joining with Chinese troops in the region around Peking. Despite fierce Japanese resistance at Kalgan, the objective was achieved in style, and on the 21st of August, the Soviet commander Pliev was able to order a dramatic symbolic gesture to emphasize the scale of his men's achievement. That day, the Soviet Mongolian Combined Cavalry Mechanized Group made a ceremonial crossing of the Great Wall of China. The progress of 17th Combined Arms Army was hardly less remarkable. With the Japanese not expecting an assault over the supposedly secure Grand Khingan Mountains, the Soviet troops were able to effect a march towards the Yellow Sea with little in the way of enemy resistance. In this sector, it was the dusty terrain and the heat of the desert sun that presented more of a problem than any Japanese defense. In temperatures of 35 degrees, heat stroke was an inevitable problem for the time of year, and yet the seemingly relentless advance continued. It was the same story across the Trans-Baikal front. On virtually every avenue of advance, the progress of the Soviet forces was overwhelming. Many units reported gains of over 100 kilometers per day. The achievement of the 6th Tank Guards Army was especially noteworthy. In the first 3 days of the offensive, this elite armoured force covered a total of 350 kilometres over difficult mountain terrain as they headed for the Manchurian plains. As events unfolded, the speed of this